One of the most inspirational, forward-looking development meetings ever to take place in Galway in the modern era was organised in September 2021 by the Galway National Park City initiative for the benefit of the councillors and officials of Galway City Council. Chaired by Micheál Ó Cinnéide, ex-director of the Environmental Protection Agency, and formally launched by Mayor Colette Connolly, with the champions of the Galway National Park City in attendance, presentations were made by an array of world-renowned London-based developers, as well as a senior official at Cardiff Council, the chief executive of World Urban Parks and former senior government official in Australia, a former European Union official recently involved in the development of the Green Deal, and the founder of the London National Park City. All these experienced and highly respected individuals spoke of their support of the National Park City designation and the benefits that it could bring Galway.
Now we're going to go to Australia for a few minutes to join Neil McCarthy from World Urban Parks. Good morning, Neil. The floor is yours.
Good morning or good evening, Brendan. And it's a pleasure to be here. Just a brief little bit about my background, and then I'll just briefly talk about some of the items that people have touched upon, but probably from a slightly different perspective. And that perspective is a mixture of the key journey items that Adelaide have been going through. And Adelaide's a government driven, as Daniel said, from the Minister in terms of becoming a national park city, but also some of the things that we've learnt along the way through the development of national parks or protected areas globally as well. So I've got a government background. I was the CEO of a statutory authority in Australia that was actually tasked to bring federal, state and local government and communities together regarding natural resource management. So I have a lot of experience in actually trying to create a partnership type model. I have a long history in internationally in parks, both protected areas, as a commissioner of the World Commission on Protected Areas with the IUCN, and obviously with World Urban Parks. And I'm just going to share my screen. And what I want to talk about very briefly is this question that always challenges people, and that's around, do you lead or do you follow? And what's the relationship between governments and community? And in that also that vexing question about development. But this is from an Adelaide perspective to a degree in terms of the journey they've been going through and some of the things that they did explore. And one of the key things they did explore, and Daniel's spoken about this, but it actually did start, really actually started with an individual in the community, not government. And it was actually someone who had a vision that created a thing called national parks that we all sort of love now. But it actually wasn't government. It was actually an individual with a really big aspiration. And in fact, there was no legislative basis for it. So therefore, why would you do it? But it's a question of leading or following. The dilemma that we've created, because it took us about 60, 70 years later after the first national park was created, where Western science created this categorisation system that might have actually limited our thinking. And this came through in the roughly late 50s, early 1960s, and it started to create this perception. And since then, we've actually been exploring it a lot further in terms of what is a national park. And what we actually saw through the 70s and 80s was a community-driven process where we started to see, and Daniel's mentioned a few of these, national parks occurring in cities, so more in the traditional model, but I was heavily involved in a community-driven process in the 80s to create the Dandenong Ranges National Park, which is actually covered, surrounded now by Melbourne, but it was actually part of Melbourne when this happened. And that was a completely different approach. And we saw this through the Scandinavian countries. As Daniel said, we saw it in Canada coming through. And we've seen a lot of changes in thinking of national parks in a city landscape as well. We also during this time saw dramatic changes about our perceptions of national parks. National parks in an American-centric, I will say, and that includes Australia, a very closed system. You know, it was an area where you actually kept people out, and it was there for the conservation of the biodiversity. However, countries like the UK, which has had a slightly different approach to national parks, we actually saw that people being connected to nature was really important. Some of that actually came out of places like Australia and New Zealand and Africa, where we started talking about traditional owners, where actually people do live, and they still live. In fact, a lot of our major national parks in Australia have quite large communities living on the land in them. And I think a lot of people are still coming to grips with that. But the biosphere model also emerged during this period. And this was changing a lot of what we thought about national parks. The other thing about national parks is that everyone goes, they're not pro-development. Yes, national parks, if you come along and suggest that we should mine a national park, obviously we're probably going to say, well, is that in the best interest of the world, the community? Probably not. You would have a similar approach if you said, look, we're going to put an open pit coal mine in the centre of Galway. You'd probably go, well, actually, that's probably not appropriate. So there are a lot of similarities about cities and landscapes and where people live and national parks, where you'd actually come to the same conclusion. The difference is in cities, we're talking about people. And this is the other big emerging concept that which you've all mentioned in terms of the pandemic, and people have really started to realise the value of nature. But I was heavily involved in the creation of Healthy Parks, Healthy People, which is over 20 years old. It has been adopted by the IUCN. It's one of their critical pillars in connecting people to nature and the value that nature gives us in actually our health. And of course, where more important is that where we live, therefore cities. So the whole concept of national parks were evolving anyway. And this is the journey that Adelaide and the South Australian government have been on over the last 30 or 40 years, and consequently why they started to move towards a national park city model for Adelaide. And I could talk about that in a lot more detail, but in that shift of thinking, it's also the other bit that's really shifted, which is really central to most governments around the world, be it local government, state or regional governments or national government, and that is actually their partnership with community. And you know, we've probably seen internationally a greater adoption of the public participation model of shifting from just informing communities to actually enabling them to collaborate with them and empower them. And really, national park cities gives a unique platform. It's probably the unique step that was going to happen in the conservation movement of sharing the responsibility. And that's been happening in conservation for a fair bit of time, but it's happening a lot more now. And therefore, you know, it is about, do you lead or do you follow? And it's more about actually your partnership with community. Now, Brendan, I've only touched upon a few things, but these are the things that Adelaide have been drifting through, and I'm happy to take questions and participate in the discussion that's coming up.
That's great, Neil. Thank you very much. And I think a lot of us really appreciate very much that little graphic you showed about the, you know, we'll say the continuum of public participation, and well done. It's not one or the other, it's the entire spectrum. So thanks, Neil, for those very interesting ideas, and we'll come back to you